Hi everyone, this is instructor Mia Hatcher, and I wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk with you a little bit about our ICD-10 coding manual. For week 2 in our class discussion, we are talking about coding manual guidelines and using them to determine whether or not we need to use multiple codes or combination codes or even with code sequencing. And so I wanted to show you a little bit of information about where you can find these guidelines in the coding manual. I also want us to talk a little bit about some of the conventions that the ICD-10 coding manual uses that will be helpful in code selection process as well. So here we have the coding manual. I'm going to flip in here to this first part. It's an introduction of the coding manual, and specifically this has the ICD-10 official guidelines for coding and reporting for this year. And in this section you'll see a lot of information about how to use the coding book for ICD-9 in general. You'll find a lot of information about general coding guidelines, which are listed here. You'll also see some information about conventions, which is another topic I would like to kind of briefly go over. But this section, like I said, in general is about how to use this coding manual to develop your coding. It also goes into specific instances with different chapters and some of the different guidelines that you'll find in those chapters. But for the sake of our conversation, in the discussion prompt, it says to discuss some of the guidelines in each of the chapters in the beginning of the book. So I want us to take a look specifically at some of those. So I'm going to turn first to the tabular listing. In this tabular listing here, I'm going to turn to the first page of the first chapter in the coding manual so that you can look at some of the guidelines that we're talking about specifically. So here on page 634, I don't know if you can see it that well, we're looking at chapter 1 in our ICD-10 coding manual, and this chapter is specifically regarding certain infectious and parasitic diseases. And if you'll note, on this chapter or in this book, all these green pages or green columns with the darker green font, these are the guidelines for this chapter specifically. So this chapter has a lot of guidelines and things that you should read about before going into coding in this chapter. And then once you flip the page, we start off with chapter 1 and we go into the different sections and subsections, and then we go to the categories and subcategories. So that's how we will use those guidelines for chapter 1. And then I'm also going to flip over to chapter 2, and it's the same thing. For chapter 2 we have neoplasms, and you'll see again these green columns with the darker green font. These are guidelines that are specific to chapter 2. So we'll read through those, and it'll just give you kind of a heads up on some of the coding caveats for this particular section. And this one has another page on it, and then we'll start in the chapter with the different sections and subsections within this chapter. Going forward in chapter 3, you'll see there's a very small section at the very top of the page. So I wanted to show this because not all chapters or not all sections in the coding manual will have quite as many guidelines as those first 2 chapters. Chapter 3 has a small little blurb right at the top here before you go into it, and it's specifically relating to the disease of the blood and blood forming organs. So you won't have to worry about it for most sections, but it's still a good habit to develop to always check the corners or the beginning pages of each chapter for these green pages and these green columns that give you the guidelines for that particular chapter. And closing on that, I also wanted to talk a little bit about coding conventions. Coding conventions like guidelines are kind of like road maps or hazard signs on the road. Like if you're a driver, you get little signs that tell you, okay, get in the left lane if you want to exit for this particular street. But your coding conventions are little flags or indicators as well that you'll find within the coding manual that show you different heads up, I guess, for how to use the codes in the sections as well. So I'm seeing several of them within these pages. Excludes 1 or excludes 2, as you can see at the beginning of this. This is an instructional note, but this excludes 2 is also considered a coding convention. It's telling us what other things that might normally be considered a disease of blood or blood forming organs. These here would not be included in this section. So that's what the excludes 2 is telling us. You also have includes, which is another popular one, unspecified. So there are different kinds of coding conventions within the pages of the tabular listing, but you'll also see them in the alphabetic index. For example, here you have, there I am, okay. For example, here it says C. vulvitis. The C is telling you that you have to go to a different term in the coding manual to fully define this particular condition, the labium. See if I can find parentheses are another one, another coding convention that you will see in the coding manual. Other than C or C also, you will see some of those in the coding manual. You'll also see parentheses in the coding manual. These are for terms that are not necessarily main terms, but they give more definition to the specific main term. So when you see a parentheses or brackets or italicized words, those are words that aren't necessarily the main words that you want to use, but they're still important to looking up a particular main term in the alphabetic index. But again, I want to stress the importance of going back to this beginning section in our book that talks about the ICD-10 coding guidelines for coding and reporting. It talks about the conventions. It talks more about the coding guidelines for each of the chapters if you're looking through those books. And it starts on page 1 of the coding manual here at the bottom. So make sure you take a look at that section in order to help kind of break down some of the terminology and keep the conversation going in our discussion this week. This should be helpful. If you have any questions about it, feel free to give me a call. I hope this helps.